Welcome to the VCA podcast, where we explore how entrepreneurs, investors, family offices, and business leaders uncover the missing piece, the hidden capability, partner, market, or connection that can change the trajectory of a business. Today, I am delighted to welcome Alex Felman. Alex sits at a rare intersection: family office, entrepreneurship, education, venture, investing, product development, and international business building. Alex is partner at Felman Family Office and founder of Bloom. His background includes molecular toxicology from UCA Berkeley, an MBA in bioentrepreneurship from Copenhagen Business School, and hands-on roles as founder, investor, board member, advisor, product developer, business developer, speaker, and educator. Alex has developed a practical framework around the idea that success does not always come from being world class at one isolated skill. It can come from combining several strong capabilities into a rare personal advantage. Today, I would like to move quickly from that individual insight to a broader question. Can the same logic apply to business development? Can a company become exceptional, not because it is the best in the world at one thing, but because it combines several good capabilities in a way the market has not yet priced? Alex, welcome.
Christophe, thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate the introduction and whatnot, and excited to be here and excited to sort of share these insights. And I think I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So, Alex, let's start with the basic proposition. Most people are taught to specialize and become the best at one thing. Your framework suggests another path: become very good at three things and combine them. How do you explain that in 2 minutes?
Sure. So I think the easiest way of framing it is that these are two different pathways to success. And then I think the first pathway that you talked about is sort of, become very, very good at one thing is what we tend to see in, let's call it superstar type situations. Let's say athletes, movie stars, Olympians, etc. The LeBron Jameses of the world, the Michael Jordans of the world, Michael Phelpses, Serena Williams, etc. But I think that for most people, this is sort of an unrealistic pathway. Most of us are not Michael Jordan or LeBron James or I don't know, Brad Pitt, or pick your person who's extremely exceptional at essentially one thing. And the flip side of this is, in essence, if you think of it this way, right? There's only one Michael Jordan. It's more about uniqueness. And so the question becomes, okay, if you can't be unique in one specific thing, like a Michael Jordan, is there another way that you can become unique? And I think this idea of essentially skill stacking, of taking different combinations of different things, can actually become a easier pathway for most individuals to become unique. Because let's say it's quite difficult to become very, very unique from being strong in only one thing, but there's almost an infinite combination of things that you can kind of stack together. And so most people could become unique by, coming up with different combinations based on their own backgrounds, in a way that is kind of authentic to themselves. And I think that's kind of the real idea here, is it's sort of, here's a pathway that is going to be easier for most people to walk down and achieve success.
Yeah, so in your deck, the idea is that being top 20% in three areas can create something close to a top 1% profile. What is the practical intuition behind that?
I mean, like the very, very basic idea behind it is, in essence, right? If you're top 20%, that means you're kind of 0.2 in the world. You multiply 0.2 by 0.2 by 0.2, you get kind of 0.08. You're just under 1%. But I think the thing is, let's say the more direct intuition is when you start to stack things together, you don't actually need to be as good at the individual things for you to get kind of outsized value. A couple of different examples, one a little bit more kind of metaphorical, one more direct to kind of where these ideas came from. I like to use the idea of, imagine going to a circus. If the circus had a bear, maybe interesting. If this bear was riding a unicycle, even more interesting. And you almost, how good could bears ride unicycles, right? Even if it's sort of good at riding a unicycle, pretty impressive. But imagine this bear is riding a unicycle and juggling, right? Again, you probably wouldn't care how strong of a juggler or unicycle rider this bear is, but those three combinations together allows an absolute amazing experience. And at least where I got introduced to these ideas was through someone called Scott Adams. People might be familiar with him as the creator of Dilbert. And he kind of used this similar combination of, from his own life, he spent some time in corporate America. He became like a cartoonist and he kind of had some amount of humor. And so he said, okay, I'm going to combine these three things, kind of corporate America, cartoonist, humor, and that created Dilbert. And the idea is that, let's say, in any of those things by himself, he wasn't good enough to be extremely successful. But by combining them in this kind of unique way to create a new thing that is kind of unique to himself, this idea of Dilbert, he became, I think, one of the top syndicated cartoonists ever. I'm reading a book of his now. At least he claimed that for a point in time, he was like one of the number one speakers or top paid speakers in the world for a number of years. And that's kind of what led to his success. He realized he was never going to be the number one cartoonist by itself, never going to be the, a number one, stand-up comedian by itself. It was never going to go super far in corporate America. But by being very good at all three and kind of combining them in a unique way, he then had a unique idea.
I want to challenge the mathematics in a minute. But before we do that, the deeper idea seems powerful. The value is not inside one skill. It is in the intersection. Is that the real point?
In a certain way, yes, it's in the intersection, but I don't think that's necessarily going deep enough in the idea of the intersection helps you get there. But I think through the intersection of things, you are actually coming up with new concepts and unique concepts. And it's sort of, in essence, let's say, by bringing in kind of ideas from one domain and connecting to ideas in a different domain, you kind of see each domain differently in a way that people who are in those domains might not look at the problem or situation, right? And so the intersection allows you to unlock insights that are unique that most people in those domains wouldn't necessarily find on their own. I think another really cool example of this is how Steve Jobs developed the first Apple personal computer. And what he did is he intersected computing, calligraphy, and architectural design. And he noted that because he kind of really randomly, he took a calligraphy class in college. And he found that, because of what he learned about calligraphy, he realized that the fonts in the computer needed to be really, really good. And he had kind of a, desire to ensure that the computer had really good fonts. And they actually attribute that to some of the success is that it made it visually beautiful and also kind of was using architectural design principles for actually how the computer looked, the computer itself, kind of the hardware. And they believe that, it was actually kind of visually beautiful that led to some of the success, right? And it was just sort of, how many people in the computer science field had integrated a background in calligraphy and understood some of the lessons from calligraphy that could then be implemented. And I think it's these types of things where, yes, it's the intersection, but it's more of all of these different fields. You learn something from them and you can apply those learnings in ways that, most people don't have those connections, and so they won't be able to see.
Let me challenge the 20% idea. How does someone actually know they are in the top 20% at something? Could 25% work? Could 21%? Is 20% a real threshold, or is it just a useful shorthand? 20% compared with whom? A student cohort, a national market, a niche market, a global pool? The answer changes completely depending on the competitive environment. There is a proverb, in the realm of the blind, the one-eyed are kings. In other words, a capability can be ordinary in one environment and exceptional in another. Should the question be less, am I top 20%? And more, in which arena is this capability scarce?
I think the point that you're getting at is a little bit more of there are some things that are, let's say, more figuratively true than literally true. And I think to a certain extent, right, this is probably more figuratively true than literally true in the sense of it's a good rule of thumb to help you, let's say, if you were to follow it, it would lead you down the right path. Kind of similar to, where the other idea comes from is it's kind of the 10,000 hour rule. There's been some people who've pushed back on it, but in general, let's say, if you live your life as if the 10,000 hour rule is true, then it's going to lead you down the path towards becoming kind of a top 1% at one thing. And I think this is kind of similar in that vein, right? Is that the numbers themselves might not be exactly true. And the question becomes, I think to your point, is top 25% okay? Sure, but then the math doesn't lead you to 1%. It leads you to, I haven't done the math off the top, but maybe it leads you to top 3% or 5% or whatever, right? It's not an exact thing. Those things will lead you to various levels of success, so to speak. So I think it's, there's that kind of balance in there. And you had your second question on here, and I'm trying to remember what that was. What was the second part? Sorry, remind me what the second piece before I kind of got it ranted on the first piece.
Yeah, the question is,
How do you know?
Yes.
How do you know? In essence, I think what a lot of people don't think about and don't realize is that most people think about skills as being bell curves, and that there's kind of an equal distribution of skills across, there's an average and there's both people on both sides. And I don't think that's actually true. I think most skills are actually more on exponential curves and more follow power laws. And actually, if you think about most skills, most people have not trained at all for most skills. And most people have not put in a lot of effort for most skills. So most people are at or near zero. And so I actually think almost intuitively, but people don't quite understand is that it's actually a lot easier to get top 20% than you believe. This is kind of my guess on it for what I've looked at, is if you look at most skill learning, and this is for anything, most skill learning follows S curves, right? So you have slow at the beginning and then you have this exponential and it kind of levels off at the end. And I would argue, at least I believe, that if you get to the top of the exponential part, so where it's growing really fast, if you get to the top of that part of the S curve, I believe you're stronger than probably 80% of the people. So I think you're in the top 20%. A different way of thinking of it, and I think this is sort of good enough, would be like, are you good enough in this skill that someone might be willing to pay you to do it for them? Is I think a really just practical way of thinking about it. Are you good enough in whatever skill we're talking about that someone might be willing to pay you some amount of money, doesn't necessarily matter how much, to do that skill for them? And I would say if you're, in most cases, it's kind of top 20% or more, then someone is likely to pay you for it. And the thing is, I don't actually think it's necessarily that high because, again, most people are at zero. Most people, for most things, they actually just need the basics done for them. And I think if you get into the top 20%, you could probably, do the basics for someone else. Most people don't necessarily need complicated things for most skills, but they're sort of applied in like very, very specific areas. And that's why I think where the stacking comes into place is that all of a sudden you can kind of, let's say, apply the basics to very unique situations because you kind of have a background of, I was helping my friend write like an entrepreneurial course and we were talking about, this guy who had a surfer's background and could then implement, skills in accounting or medicine or whatever, right? How many people, have a surfing background, but also have, let's say, an accounting background, right? And starting to do, let's say, accounting for surfers or something like that, right? You can set up these interesting things that gets very, very specific for different groups of people that then really want.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point, which is, are people willing to pay for those skills? So, because we want to move from individual skills to see if we can apply this to companies. So there's one strategic question for companies because we're still looking at, being in the top 20%, as a starting point in 3 different areas. So for a company, a strategic question is maybe not, are we excellent, but is it in which market context are we unusually strong? Is that the question as a company you should be asking yourself, to identify the 20%?
I mean, I would say, in my opinion, I think it's a little bit different. I would say it's something along the lines of what capabilities are we, let's say, strong in that we can then combine in a way that makes us unique. Because I actually think it's more about uniqueness, right? And I think a certain way that you can almost think about it is almost like a lock and key model, is that by doing things in a very, very specific way, then you become very targeted fits for people's needs. And let's say the more that you fit different people's needs, the more likely they're willing to buy for you, and the more likely they're willing to kind of pay a premium for that service, right? And so to a certain extent, let's say if you are more generic across one domain, or even if you're like very, very strong across one domain, it kind of fits, but you're kind of not exactly solving people's problems in a way that exactly fits their own needs. But as you sort of start to stack these, then you can kind of target yourself very, very specifically for the needs of specific groups. And by that, you can kind of, get pricing power. You can increase your sales, your conversion rates, all these types of things, because, they talk a lot about, finding your niche. In essence, it can become a way to really find your niche, and find places where, they talk about, blue ocean strategies and whatnot. And I think this becomes a method of doing that. That instead of being like, oh, we're going to find our kind of blue ocean by being super, super good in this one area, it's actually, no, let's stack these things on top of each other, and kind of the intersection, and figuring out like, okay, what is this kind of unique thing we can put out in the world by the intersection of our strengths? Then that's where you actually have the blue ocean, if that makes sense. Or you can almost have a monopoly on that specific.
So let's focus on the intersection here. I mean, again, I want to challenge the maths, and it's probably because I've got an engineering background, but it says like 20% times 20% times 20% gives you 0.8%, but that works only if the skills are independent. But often, I mean, skills overlap.
Sure.
Business skills, communication skills, fundraising skills, leadership skills. They are not clear independent variables. If two skills are highly correlated, multiplying them exaggerates a rarity. If they are two unrelated, the combination may be rare, but useless. There's a French philosopher called Paul Valéry, and he said, if a solution is simple, then it is wrong. And if it is complex, then it is useless. So how do you find the useful middle ground?
So let's go on the first side of overlapping skills. I would say one of the big things on that side is let's say a number of things that you mentioned are almost looking at the skills at too high of a level, and are not really drilling down at the kind of necessary specificity that is really necessary to understand this. But I think also, let's say overlapping skills, I don't know, a simple one off the top of my head that you might think would be something like communication and storytelling. You could potentially be like, oh, I'm strong in these things. I would argue that those things are, I think in a lot of ways, when you have the two things, when they're kind of codependent on each other, they're not fully independent. It's because they are almost kind of angles of the same skill and should probably be lumped together in your analysis. So let's say storytelling and communication, that should be kind of lumped as one. And so maybe, for example, just an idea from what you were talking about, right? If you're trying to do an exercise to try to figure these out, maybe I like to use double diamond as a one where you kind of have these kind of expansive, and kind of you expand your thinking, then you narrow it down. And one of the things that you help narrow it down is by clustering ideas together. So as you're kind of, let's say, brainstorming, where are we really strong? Where do we have strong capabilities? You can then, once you kind of come up with some lists, go like, oh, which of these are kind of related to each other? And maybe there's some way for you to kind of describe them as kind of a similar concept, right? Of kind of have them as an umbrella thing that, okay, maybe it's communication, storytelling, whatever. That's kind of one skill, and sort of treat it as one. And let's say maybe to this point, you're almost not running the exercise correctly because you're sort of treating one skill as two, let's put it like that, right? And so I think going through this and really kind of going like, oh, these skills are actually really related to each other, or they're kind of sub-skills of the same thing, let's bring them back. So I think that's one thing about it. I think on the other side about it, right, is when you pull these, you talked about the skills being useless. I think it becomes a matter of, I don't know, does this combination actually add value to the people you're trying to bring value towards? That's, I think, what it comes down to at the end of the day. Some combinations will, some combinations won't. To a certain extent, I think that's kind of the the challenge of business, right, is to figure out which of these combinations actually provides value to the person you're trying to provide value for. I think, the question starts to become, does this actually do something uniquely for the other side that makes their lives better? If the answer to that question is yes, then you're probably onto something. If the answer to that question is no, then you probably have to go back to the drawing board and see, like, maybe there's something that we can do, or maybe you're sort of, let's say, not applying the lessons of the skills in the right way, right? Maybe you're kind of applying it in the wrong way, and there's sort of a different way to utilize the different skills maybe it's not a different combination, but it's sort of, a different output of how do you, synthesize them into a unique product, service, offering, insight, etc. That would be sort of my
those sales, leads me into my other comment I wanted to say here is that we need to define skill. Saying, maths is a skill is too broad. Learning maths can take forever. The teams, sub-teams, sub-teams. The same is true in business. Sales, strategy, AI, or finance are not precise enough. You cannot be top 20% in strategy. It doesn't really make any sense. So if we try to extrapolate this to the business, should we think in terms of capabilities rather than skills? For example, I don't want to talk about sales, but selling complex intangible services to conservative decision makers. I would not be talking about AI, but I'll be talking about capability of turning proprietary CRM data into broad level decision support. Thinking in terms of capabilities for a business, would that be the starting point, to identify you three components that you need to combine?
I almost, to a certain extent, think what you're talking about here is almost semantics, right? But I do think what you've touched on that is a good thing, is that I think you need to get more specific with how you're defining your skills or capabilities, and you need to get very into like the nitty gritty of what is the either insight or change or whatever that this skill is unlocking, right? Of sort of, let's say, I'm going to use this example going back to what we said before when we talked about Steve Jobs. What he learned from calligraphy is the powerful of beautiful text. And he sort of learned from calligraphy as a skill, but kind of, let's say, the insight from that was there's a huge power in beautiful text. And he said, okay, when I'm creating a computer where there's going to have to be text on the screen, we want the text to be beautiful, because he learned that from his calligraphy background. And that was kind of the insight from there is that text should be beautiful, right? And I think from the skills or capabilities, and I think you can use those words fairly interchangeably, the question becomes, what is this kind of the insight or the really, really specific change that you're making? You touched on some, because if you don't get, let's say, specific enough, then it's going to be kind of hard. AI is a big word, strategy is a big word. It can mean, I think the other thing as well, right? Those words can mean a lot of things. And so if you don't define them well, let's say within your organization, then you're not really going to have the insights necessary to produce something unique.
So my take here is that a company should not define its edge as we do AI or we do advisory. It should define its edge at the capability combination level. What exactly that we do, for whom, in what context, and why is the combination difficult to replicate? So perhaps, the formula is not a calculation, it is a strategic rarity model. The point is not so much that 20 times 20 times 20 equals exactly 0.%. The point is that it's unusual combinations is what creates scarcity. The real formula is not probability, it's positioning. You just need to pick an arena where your capabilities matter. You need to define capabilities narrowly enough to be meaningful, and make sure that capabilities are complementary, not merely overlapping. This is exactly where VCA's cross-pollination thesis enter. We are not looking for random instructions. We're looking for capability combinations that the market has not yet seen clearly.
The way that I see it is much more so almost a equation for uniqueness. Is this will help you figure out how are you unique? Where can you sort of stand out in your market? There's a really good book. I'm blanking on the name of this marketing book. It'll come back to me at some point. But they had this idea of you want to kind of own a piece of your kind of customers or prospects a piece of their mind, where people go, oh, when I think of this, I think of you. And I think if you aren't unique in what you're doing, then people won't kind of associate that domain with what you're doing. And so I think that a better way of thinking of this is the equation for uniqueness. And that in essence, let's say from the math side, the math says that as long as you're kind of combining at least, and again, it could be more things, but at least three, that will give you a unique enough proposition that you probably will be unique in the market. And I think that's more of a way of thinking about it, is that this is an equation for uniqueness. And by being unique, you can kind of stack these things together.
So a company may not have the best product, the strongest brand, or the largest distribution network, but if it combines a good product, a good market access, a strong trust, the resulting value proposition can become extraordinary. So do you think companies also have a zone of genius?
Sure. I would put it like this. I think companies become an extension of the people who are in it, and the team and whoever's inside, right? And in the same way that people have zones of genius, I think companies kind of have, almost a meta zone of genius based on the skills and the capabilities of the people under it. And I think where a lot of companies get in trouble is when they sort of try to start to do things that are kind of outside their domain. You'll see this kind of a lot, right? They'll try to do things that aren't really associated with them outside their domain, and it usually kind of falls flat. People don't really associate with that. And so I really do think there is a zone of genius for most, if not almost all companies, where if you think about it, right, it's sort of maybe defining this for the audience, right? The zone of genius is sort of what you're really good at, which is kind of a little bit of what we're talking about on the uniqueness side, but also what you're willing to kind of do longer than others. What is kind of easier for you to do than other people. And that sort of allows you to do it for a longer period of time. And I think most companies are kind of, just the way people are kind of designed to do that way. I think most
You
companies
touched on a point, kind of the comfort zone that some companies, they get lost there. How would you diagnose a company's version of an energy audit, where activities create disproportionate value and which activities drain resources? Because if you're taking, three different angles, at some point you still have to focus.
Sure. I think one of the things, I'm going to answer it for like this, there's many different pieces to a company. So there's a lot of places that you could talk around this, but I think one of the most obvious examples of this is I think many companies essentially try to service too many customers. And what they tend to find is that, let's say, some customers, don't tend to pay them that much, but also the customers that don't tend to pay them that much tend to actually cause them to spend the most energy, that they tend to be kind of, let's say, to a certain extent, because they tend to be the least satisfied. Let's say, maybe backing up a second. Customers that don't tend to pay as much, the reason they're not paying as much is because they're not getting as much value from what you're doing. Because if they got more value, they might be willing to pay more. But almost definitionally, they're not paying more because they're not getting as much value. And if they're not getting as much value, then most likely they're kind of, let's say, dissatisfied or underwhelmed in what you're doing for them, which means they're going to be kind of more unhappy. They're going to complain more, et cetera, et cetera. So that means that they're going to actually need more energy from your organization to service them, because ultimately it's kind of, again, it's not as good of an experience for them. They're not getting as much value for it. Whereas on the flip side, right, your highest paying customers tend to almost have the opposite approach. Because they're getting so much value, they tend to be happier. They tend to complain less. They tend to actually need less energy. So I think, for example, you can actually almost energy audit your customers by actually firing your customers and going like, okay, based on kind of our offering to the market, who is finding that our offering is the most valuable? And most likely, I would say that by using these ideas of uniqueness, you can kind of zero down on who those people are. Or maybe, right, maybe the people who are attracted to your company and find it to be the most valuable will help you discover, oh, we're actually really, it's our combination of, A and B that is really making it interesting for these people. Oh, so maybe we never thought about B before, whatever B is, but that's actually kind of, one of the things that makes us stand out. It's maybe you have a really big insight to an industry or something like that where, other players in your field don't. So people coming from that industry really like your product or service, even if you're more kind of broad. I don't know, think accounting software, right? Maybe you're really good at accounting software for athletes, or who knows, right? You might have that, so all your best customers are athletes, right? But all the ones who aren't athletes, it's not the same thing. And so I think that becomes one of the real energy audits, is that like actually you can do the energy audits on your customers and realize that the customers that are paying more and actually easier to deal with means you're actually providing better service and value to them. And it actually maybe makes more sense to kind of fire your other customers. And you can actually, make more money and have better kind of operating margins by doing that, because essentially you're not spending that much time and energy on your kind of low value customers.
Yeah. So in your opinion, I mean, can a company be too obsessed with becoming better at one thing when the real business development upside is in combining existing capabilities differently?
So, I mean, I think to a certain extent, yes, is that I think what you end up having there is I think you almost end up, in essence, like an innovator's dilemma situation, which is quite common, right? Let's say a company has done very, very well on one specific thing, and then they try to drive that thing into the ground. And then it becomes sort of, you don't want to destroy the golden goose, or your cash cow or whatever, but they don't really start to add things on that, and maybe that starts to die over time. You see this in a number of different companies, that there's a big problem with the innovator's dilemma. So I do think that is the thing, is that you do need to kind of have some kind of layering. By doing this, it expands your capabilities, right? And if you're we're going to be just super, super expert at one thing, at some point, that's going to run its course, right? And by kind of doing this across maybe multiple areas, it kind of spreads your ability to touch different contexts.
As VCR says, is that many opportunities are not weak; they're just incomplete. They are missing one piece: a partner, a market, a technology layer, a financial structure, a regulatory pathway, an operator, a credibility bridge, or a sector-specific insight. That missing piece is often invisible from inside the company's own industry. It appears only when you cross-pollinate across sectors, geographies, capital sources, and operating models. Is cross-pollination a form of strategic skill stacking at ecosystem level?
Sure. No, I think that's 100%. I think this echoes kind of what I was talking about before, right? Is that, let's say, through this cross-pollination, for most companies, right, you have your unknown unknowns, and it sort of shifts some of the unknown unknowns into at least domains that you can work with. Even if it's not a complete known known, it could be kind of a known unknown, or a known known, etc. And it can kind of shift some of these things into those domains. And once it shifts there, then it becomes, right, information you can do something about. And so it's sort of become, I like to sort of see it as, let's say, imagine you're like on top of a mountain. There's stuff that you can see, and you can only kind of deal with the stuff that you can see. But let's say maybe, for example, what this allows you to do is, I don't know, over a different mountain, like the clouds have parted, right? And so now you can see more of a different area that you couldn't see before. And I think that's essentially what these cross-pollination does. If you're looking at a landscape, it opens up clouds or fog in an area, so that now that you have access to seeing things in that area, and potentially, again, it's not a guarantee, but potentially that opens you up to seeing kind of your area in a new way, and allows you to do things a little bit differently. And realistically, if, kind of everyone, let's say most people in the same industry or whatnot, are kind of looking at things in a similar mindset, so you're probably going to be the only company in your industry that has this insight, because it's unlikely that other people, and let's say the more independent and different this insight is coming from, the less likely that other people in your industry are looking for, are seeing the same insight that you are.
This can also divert your attention from your core business. How do you distinguish a powerful combination from a superficial one?
I'm just going to echo what I said before. The question becomes, like, does this ultimately add value to your customers or partners or whatever, right? I think it's kind of similar to, I'm a biologist by background. I think it's kind of similar to DNA, right? DNA gets combined in different ways. A lot of them, like most combinations of DNA and like mutations, end up leading to nonsense. Most of them just don't really go anywhere. Another group leads to actual negative things, right? It actually could hurt you. But then another group actually leads to, changes for the organism that are actually, improve their survival. And then that is what continues forward. And I think it's the same thing for businesses, right? What is the insight from this domain or field, and how can we apply this insight to what we're doing? Is there something here that we can apply to ourselves that would sort of make our business better, or make our customers happier, or provide more value, or whatever? And at least for me, I think at the end of the day, the question is, does this provide more value to our end customer? Yes or no? And I think you can kind of run that test of, do we think we can use this in a way to provide more value to our end customer? Yes or no? If we think it does, great. If not, then,
Yeah. So in your experience, especially with family offices, do you believe that family offices have a particular advantage over other companies? Because they typically see across generations, asset classes, sectors, and geographies.
I personally think they can. I do think so. So, for example, my family office, we're both investing in funds and companies. And so because we're investing in funds and companies, we're seeing kind of the entire market, right? And I think there are very, very few stakeholders that essentially everyone is trying to sell to them. So everyone is knocking on their door. So you're seeing everything, right? And that gives you, I think, it's not necessarily about, I mean, in a way it's about what we're talking about, but it's not exactly that, but it sort of gives you a much bigger, clearer picture of the entire kind of universe, right? And by getting a clearer picture of the universe, I do think you can make better decisions, or at least be more informed about, okay, this is kind of what's going on here, right? Because you're more able to see these different fields and go like, oh, something that's happening in field A is actually probably going to affect something that's happening in field B, and the likelihood that those two fields are talking to each other might be relatively small. But we're able to see what's going on at a higher level, maybe more like a helicopter above everything, where I think most people at best might be in the trees compared to on the ground, but very few people can see the whole
Indeed.
forest.
And this is not to introduce people. I don't like to qualify ourselves as a brokerage firm. What we really try to do is we try to identify and design combinations that should exist but do not yet exist. Once a market has named a category, the opportunity is already visible. The more interesting question is, how do you identify a valuable combination before the market has a name for it? Are unknowns opportunities often hidden in intersections where no single industry has ownership?
Sure. I mean, I certainly believe that. I think it's around this concept of, I think very, very few people are looking at the intersections, because it's sort of, let's say, it's unlikely for the people in those industries to interact with each other. So it's unlikely for them to know what's going on in these fields. And so, in essence, I would say, I think one of the things that people, for a lot of companies, kind of over index is they think, oh, this idea that I have in this industry is completely unique or new or whatnot. And I think unless you're bringing in things from outside the industry, it's unlikely that it's going to actually be a unique idea. That most likely, if it's kind of within the same domain, it's very rare that you're going to come up with something completely new. And if that's the case, then most of your competitors or stakeholders or whatnot have already thought of it. And I think, for example, I see this from, as an investor, a lot of the funds or companies I see are actually offering the same or nearly identical offerings. It's kind of the same investment. They're not unique. And I think it's more likely that you can come up with something that is unique, that is an actual insight in these kind of unknown unknowns, in sort of the intersections. And you can sort of think of the intersections as it's like blind spots in the knowledge of humanity, but it's sort of that, or not necessarily blind. It's a blind spot, but it's not necessarily complete unknown, if that makes sense. I would actually argue the intersection is a little bit more of an unknown known than an unknown unknown, if that makes sense. It's sort of, if you took these ideas and put them together, it would make lots of sense, but no one is thinking about putting those ideas together. I think that's a better way of thinking. So those are kind of both unknown knowns, right? They're kind of known, but people don't know that they know that. And by kind of combining these different areas of insight and expertise, it can kind of unlock them and move them into kind of a known. And I think it's a little bit more about that. Of yes, there is some insights of kind of complete exploration to things we completely don't know, but I think this is actual more so is that there are people who know these things or have directions of these things, but because they're not like talking to each other, they kind of don't know all the pieces. And I think that's kind of where it becomes much more easier to kind of actually develop this, is because it kind of unlocks the pieces and goes, oh, actually the knowledge is already there, right? And there's a bit of almost a standing on the shoulders of giants situation. Is the knowledge is there across different domains, but no one is having the domains talk to each other. And so you can have the opportunity by connecting the
they're
domains
known,
and have
but
them talk.
not by the same people. So let's make this
Yeah,
practical.
exactly.
If a CEO, founder, or a family business leader wants to apply this tomorrow, what should they do?
Sure. I think the biggest start around this is essentially a form of self-assessment and self-awareness of really trying to analyze, like, okay, what are our internal strengths? What are the things that we are kind of, top 20%, you're still above average, you're maybe, good to great in those things, but maybe you're not, completely extraordinary in them. So I think that's the first start, is sort of like, okay, what are the things that we are very, very good at, that people kind of look to us for. And then I think the question starts to become a little bit of what we were talking before, is like, okay, are some of these things almost a bundling exercise, right? Which of these things are kind of related to each other, so that we're not kind of looking at them, we're not kind of double dipping, so to speak, right? We're not kind of taking them into account twice, and start to bundle those ideas together. And then you can start to look like, okay, is there something that we can do that is at the intersection of these clusters, and to try to create, I would say it's most likely going to be either a new product, a new service, or a new way of a new like target market, or a new way of kind of marketing or presenting our offering, right? You might not even need to change anything. You're just realizing that, like, oh, if we present what we do in a different way, actually we'll be a lot more successful than what we're doing now. And I think those are kind of the outcomes, is probably going to be a product or service, a new target market, or a new kind of marketing way of explaining how the organization is.
Yeah, ideally, we should not want to add in too much complexity. I mean, the objective is to find the simplest combination that makes the business harder to ignore.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, right? Is that's sort of the idea. Is, again, I keep echoing this a little bit, but I think the goal is sort of to use this to help you figure out, how is your business unique, and then how do you present your uniqueness to the market, so that when people want that, they first think of you. There's a really good one. There's a book called Zag, which is a marketing book, and they came up with this idea of the onlyness statement, of you as a business can say, we are the only company that does XYZ. And I think you can kind of use this concept to help you come up with what is this kind of thing where you are the only ones that really offer this unique package. And that, so if you want this unique package, they need to come to you.
And thank you, Alex. Alex, if I try to summarize the conversation, the individual lesson is that outlier success does not always require being the best in the world at one isolated thing. It can come from combining strong capabilities in a rare and useful way. But the business lessons may be even more important. Companies can also create outlier value by combining capabilities that already exist but are not yet connected. Products, trust, access, capital, technology, data, sector knowledge, governance, and ecosystem reach. That is where I see the link with VCA. We look for the missing piece, the non-obvious connection that can turn a good value proposition into an extraordinary one. So perhaps the better question is not, are we the best at one thing? The better question is, what combination could make us uniquely valuable in the right markets? Final question, Alex, for someone listening today, an entrepreneur, investor, or family business leader what is the one question they should ask themselves after this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I think the big things, right, is really looking at, what are those skills, what are those capabilities, do kind of an internal audit of really helping identify like where do you stand out. I think that's where I would start. If you haven't done that, either as an individual or a company or organization, if you haven't done that kind of self audit and awareness, I think it all starts from there. So figure out, what are those things where you can stand out, and then you can start to think about how do we combine them.
Thank you, Alex, for attending our VCA podcast. Thanks to the audience for listening. Please hit the subscribe button and see you in the next episode.